Hello, it's lovely to see you all this morning and welcome to the first of our two December talks. And today we're going to be talking about collections and collectors at the British Museum. So let's get started. I'm going to first of all pull up my screen and we will begin from the beginning. Let me just pick up my trusty laser pointer and we are ready to rock and roll. Excellent. So collections and collectors at the British Museum. The British Museum collection was famously established in 1753 with 3 foundation collections, all built up by private collectors. And since then, the collections of the British Museum have been augmented by other famous and not so famous collectors. And what we're going to do today is find out about a selection of these collectors and how their personal interests have helped to shape the national collection now held at the British Museum. And we're going to begin by talking about those foundation collections that started the museum off in 1753. And we have here 3 objects that came to the museum in 1753 as part of the foundation collections. At the top left, we have a copy of the Lindisfarne Gospels, created around AD 720. And what we see here is the opening page for the Gospel of St. Matthew. Next to it, we have a copy of a prayer book. And this prayer book was from a different founding collection. And this prayer book belonged to Lady Jane Grey. And it is open at the page where we see the start of the Lord's Prayer as part of the prayer book. And the prayer book also contains annotations in some of the margins written by Lady Jane Grey herself. And then at the bottom left, we have a detail from a manuscript which shows a diagram of the human eye, dated from either the 13 or the 1400s. And these 3 objects, ironically, given that our talk is about the British Museum, are now all part of the collection at the British Library. And that will form part of what we talk about today, the way in which not only the collection has grown at the British Museum, but has also been divided and has been spread across other museums across time. So the British Museum collection itself began with the collection of Sir Hans Sloane. And he was a London-based doctor and scientist from Ulster, who bequeathed a collection to King George II to be held on behalf of the nation in return for the payment of £20,000 to Hans Sloane's heirs, principally his daughter Elizabeth. And in his will, Sloane stipulated that if the money was not forthcoming from the British government within a set number of months, the collection should be offered to other institutions in London, Oxford, Edinburgh, Paris, Berlin, Madrid, and St. Petersburg. And he included what you could sort of call a sliding scale of the order in which these institutions were to be offered his collection for the sum of £20,000. The collection itself consisted of 71,000 objects, including 40,000 printed books, 7,000 manuscripts, extensive natural history specimens, prints and drawings, together with ancient objects from Egypt, Greece, Rome, ancient Near East, Asia, and the Americas. So within that collection, you can see a lot of the starting points for the current departments at the British Museum, such as the Department of Prints and Drawings. You can also see that some sections of that collection, such as the natural history specimens, are no longer part of the collection held on site at Bloomsbury, but were then used to found the Natural History Museum in Kensington. And the manuscripts, such as the Lindisfarne Gospel that we see on the screen, then were moved to found the British Library up at the Euston Road when all of the holdings were transferred from the British Museum Library up to the new building near King's Cross in the 1990s. On the 7th of June 1753, George II gave his assent to the Act of Parliament which established the British Museum and officially transferred Hans Sloane's collection from his estate to the nation. And the museum was founded with the addition of a library assembled by Sir Robert Cotton and also the Harleian Library assembled by the Earls of Oxford. And these libraries included printed books dating back to the 500s, 1500s, written documents and medieval illuminated manuscripts. And the two items you see on screen below the Lindisfarne Gospel are examples of two objects that came from those other two founding library collections. Since then, the British Museum collection has been reorganised internally and, as we've already mentioned, across a number of associated institutions, such as the Natural History Museum and the British Library. And the collection has also grown in size, necessitating the rebuilding of the original Montague House site and the continued development of the existing site, such as the construction of the World Conservation and Exhibition Centre in the northwest corner of the museum site in Bloomsbury. And another thing that we'll be talking about today is the idea of a collection and collections. The British Museum itself refers to all the objects which it holds as the British Museum collection in the singular. Within that, there are a number of smaller collections, sometimes based around cultural areas, sometimes based around a particular collector who gave, bequeathed or sold that collection to the British Museum. And in addition, the objects are organised internally under a number of departments, such as the Department of Ancient Egypt and the Sudan, the Department of Coins and Medals. So some of the departments, as you can see, represent a cultural or geographical area, others represent a material type. And those departments have changed over time. So as we go through our talk today, we will sometimes refer to departments which were extant when a particular collection came into the museum, but not only does the collection continue to grow and be reorganised, but so the departments within the British Museum are continually changing. So let's move on to our first collector. And the first collector we're going to meet is Sarah Sofia Banks. And here we see a portrait of Sarah by the artist Angelica Kaufman. And to the left, we have a print, which is part of the British Museum collection, which gives us a view of Soho Square, which is where Sarah lived. It's a view looking west. And it also reminds us that at this time, London was an area where you would see animals being driven through the streets as part of the droving routes that came in from the countryside, bringing sheep and in this case cattle into the capital as part of the food process for feeding people in the capital. And this dates to 1812. Now, Sarah Sofia Banks has more than 15,000 objects related to her collection in the British Museum. She was the sister of the botanist Sir Joseph Banks, and she worked recopying and editing the manuscripts of Banks' Newfoundland Voyage, which was published in 1766. Sarah was born on Argyle Street in Soho, to William and Sarah Banks, and she probably began collecting during her teenage years. She was known for her extensive collection of prints, coins, tokens, and general ephemera such as playbills, advertisements and newspaper clippings. And this collection was bequeathed by Dorothea Banks, who was her sister-in-law, married to Joseph Banks, and she lived with Dorothea and Joseph at their house 32 Soho Square from 1777. And on her death, her collection was immediately donated by her sister-in-law to the British Museum. The coin collection, which formed part of her collection, is now divided between the British Museum and the Royal Mint Museum, while the prints in her collection are housed at the British Museum, and some of them have transferred to the British Library. Now, Sarah had a particular interest in collecting contemporary objects, in contrast to other collectors who tended to focus on collecting ancient objects. And as such, her collection gives us an insight into the Britain of the late 1700s. And here we have a couple of trade cards from tradespeople operating in London in the late 1700s. Now, a trade card is a square or rectangular card about the size of a modern visiting or business card, and it was exchanged as a way for businesses to distribute to existing clients and potential clients. The trade cards first became popular at the end of the 1600s in Paris and London. They functioned as advertising, but they could also act as maps directing the public to the merchant stores. And the growing use of trade cards fueled demand for surfaces such as etching, engraving and printmaking. Eventually, trade cards evolved into business cards, which are still used today. So the two examples we have here show us at the top the business card of Mary Shirley, who is operating as a cooper at number 13 Water Lane, Tower Street. And the card also has an illustration, so as well as the text telling us about her trade and where she can be found, the illustrations also back up the idea of what is available at her business, the creation of barrels. So she was probably here supplying to merchants and the brewing industry the barrels that were then used for storing and transporting goods in and out of London at the time. Below, we have the trade card of J. Bannister, who is a hosier operating in 1814. His business is probably a domestic family business, and we can see that it is located at number 98, the Strand. And at the time, because there were no street maps, no A to Zs, we can also see that he's added on a bit of extra information to make it easy for people to find the premises that he's operating from, because he says that it's 2 doors down from the Bedford buildings. So the trade cards not only give us an insight into the different trades that were operating across London at the time, but they also give us an indication of the road names and the numbering that was in operation in different parts of London in the late 1700s, early 1800s. Some of these roads are still extant. Some of them have been redeveloped and built over in modern times. Another part of Sarah's collection was her numismatic collection, which included 9,000 objects. And this numismatic collection included coins and also examples of what we see here on screen, which are known as tokens. Now, Sarah recorded who gave her her objects, as well as the people to whom she gave coins, tokens and medals. And these listings cover 8,500 objects and make it possible to identify more than 500 individuals, from Princess Elizabeth, who was the daughter of King George III, to Mr. Varsi, a porter, who gave her the objects. And these objects are an incredible set of objects in that they have a very clear provenance. This listing gives us a very clear indication of how the objects not only came from Sarah's collection into the British Museum, but how Sarah herself originally acquired them. And as well as these donations, she also brought objects for her collection. Her coins and tokens were stored in wooden cabinets in her bedroom on the first floor of 32 Soho Square. And her catalogue, her 7-volume catalogue of her collection, which she started compiling from around 1815, showed that she organised her collection geographically. And then within each geographical area, the coins were organised according to date and the metal that they came from. And as well as collecting the objects themselves, she collected information about them, including newspaper clippings, as well as information gathered from her own contacts in the field. And some of this information gives us an insight into the use, the original history of objects that is available from no other source. And what we have here are 2 metal alloy tokens. The top one is a halfpenny token produced in 1797 for Low Hall Colliery in Northumberland. And it shows a miner guiding baskets next to a horse on a gin. And horse gins were used in coal mining areas, particularly where the coal was in shallow seams and there was no need to dig deep mine shafts. And the gin has a wooden wheel on a spindle that's moved around by the horse and operates a simple pulley system that is raising and lowering the loads up and down the shaft. And we can see that this token was issued in 1797. The token below is also dated. This one was issued in 1794, and it is a Romney Marsh halfpenny. On one side, it has the initials WP with the crest of a lamb, probably representing a local breed which had evolved from medieval longwool types and by 1800 was recognised as the Romney Marsh or the Kent breed. And on the other side, there is a figure of Justice with her sword in her right hand and a pair of scales in her left, justice being one of the 4 cardinal virtues. And the inscription around her reading, "For the honour and use of trade." Now, the names of the local tradespeople responsible for issuing these tokens was usually impressed on the rim, and on the rim, which we cannot see in this image of the token, it says payable at W Parish, Dymchurch. And we know from records that William Parish was a local trader who owned 4 High Street Dymchurch from 1784 to 1837. The building itself still exists and is currently operating as a gift shop. So why are we looking here at tokens created by individuals local to an area, rather than the coin of the realm, which we would expect to see being used, as it is nowadays, for personal purchases in shops of the time? Well, England suffered a chronic shortage of official small change from the mid-1600s to the early 1800s, quite simply because the government failed to mint enough copper farthings, half-farthings, half-pennies and pennies, and these were essential for small sales. with items of a low value. And this forced local businesses to produce their own tokens for daily commerce. And as long as merchants accepted the tokens for purchase at face value, the public would accept them in change. And these privately produced token coins, made of lead, tin, brass or copper, were in circulation from the reign of Elizabeth I up until the latest examples, such as the ones we see here, during the reign of George III. And what we find is that these tokens would have been used within a local region. So the one from Dymchurch would have been circulated not only in the village of Dymchurch, but across businesses on the Romney Marsh, hence its inscription, the Romney Marsh halfpenny. And I also think it's quite interesting that on one side, we have the figure of justice, because these examples of local currency have to operate with a level of trust behind them, in that merchants not only have to be prepared to accept them in exchange for goods, but also they have to know that they can then put it into change that they are giving to customers, so that these coins will circulate around the local economy. So it's interesting that they also, particularly in the Dymchurch example, really pick up on a lot of symbolism and inscriptions that you would expect to see on a coin of the realm, who they are replacing due to the lack of small change at the time. Unfortunately, counterfeits soon appeared, quality declined, and the tokens themselves were banned in 1797, with active circulation ending around 1804. You may know that nowadays there are some examples of local currencies in operation. In Stratford-on-Avon up in Warwickshire, for a while they handed out transport tokens, which were handed out to older members of the community and which could be used in local taxis for travelling around the local Stratford area. And in Brixton, they had a form of currency called the Brixton pound note, which again could be used in local businesses to try and encourage people to shop locally. Now, the next collection we're going to look at is a collection known as the Percival David collection. And we can see to the left of the screen two of the most famous objects from that collection. And on the right of the screen, we see a photo of the collection as it now looks in the British Museum. And around 200 pieces are displayed in cases in the centre of the Percival David Gallery. Here we see the centre, what we call island cases, with a further 1,200 pieces around the edge of the room in the tall wall cases. And what is on display is not the complete collection, because it also contained lacquer work, jade, enamel, and a large number of books, which are now held in a study room next door to the gallery. And the ceramic collection of the British Museum dates from essentially the Song to the Qin dynasties, so 1900s to 1700s China, and took about 40 years to be put together. And the collection focuses on pieces made for the imperial court in China, and has a high proportion of inscribed and dated pieces. And Percival David, in collecting these objects, aimed to create a collection that was not just purely aesthetic, but also had a scientific and historical basis to it. Now, the two pieces we see here, known as the Percival David vases, are two altar vases. They came as a pair, and you can see that at the top they have elephant-headed handles, and they are decorated with 4 clawed dragons flying through a skyscape with clouds. And then at the bottom, bands of peonies scrolling around the feet. Now, originally, the vases had porcelain rings through the handles, and the dedication, which we can see at the top of each vase, records that they are dated to AD 1351, and that they were created as objects to be gifted to a temple in northeast China. Now, the vases were made at a time when China itself was at the heart of a vast Mongol empire, and trade was flourishing between China and the Middle East. And the cobalt, the blue used to create the intense dark blue decoration on these vases, would have been traded from Iran. They're named after Sir Percival David, but the vases themselves came into his collection from two separate sources. So having been created as a pair, they then became separated, and Percival David acquired the first one from the collections of Charles Ernest Russell, and the second one was acquired in 1927 for an unknown price from the collector William Efston. Altogether, there are 20 other objects from the Efston collection which are part of the Percival David collection. And this is an interesting aspect of collections in the British Museum, is that often collections will have embedded within them sub-collections where a particular collector has either taken over someone else's collection, or a collection has at some point in its history been actively curated by the collector, who decides to sell off particular parts of the collection to raise capital to buy new pieces, or because they want to change the direction of their collection. Or the collection is sold en masse, perhaps after the death of the collector, and becomes fragmented across various museums and other private collections. And you'll hear this as a theme as we go through some of the other collections today. Now, Percival David himself was born in Bombay in 1892 and graduated from Bombay and Cambridge universities, where he studied law. And this was his career before he discovered Chinese art. He moved to London in 1912 and started collecting Chinese art the next year. He first visited China in 1932, and then in 1923, and then in 1925, helped to finance and mount an exhibition of objects from the Imperial collection in the Forbidden City in Beijing. And it was these connections with the Imperial collection that enabled him to acquire objects from the Forbidden City, which were being sold off at that time by members of the late Qin dynasty imperial household. He brought 40 pieces and exported them to Britain. Now, much of the acquisition history of his collection is unrecorded, and he may have acquired items from dealers, auctions, and other collectors. 1931, he purchased a flat in the Dorchester Hotel when it opened, and this was where his collection was initially housed. Before this, in the 1920s, he had bought a country house in Henley, and this was where his collection was stored when it was moved out of London during World War II. And the house itself, during the 1970s, when it no longer housed the collection, was bought by George Harrison of the Beatles. And during the 1930s, Percival David became active in museums, and he was involved in a 1935 international exhibition of Chinese art at the Royal Academy. And here we can see him looking at objects which are going to become part of this exhibition, together with Tang Hesfen, who was the exhibition secretary, Percival David being the exhibition committee director. The exhibition ran at the Royal Academy and included a number of objects which Percival David loaned from his own collection. Now, he was determined to keep his collection in one piece, and therefore he donated the entire collection to the University of London in 1950. And in 1952, it opened to the public in this building, 53 Gordon Square, Camden. Unfortunately, due to a funding crisis, the Gordon Square building closed in late 2007, since when the ceramic collection has been loaned on a long-term basis to the British Museum, where it has been on public display in room 95 since the 23rd of April 2009. And a key provision of this long-term loan is that all the pieces in the collection have to be on view to the public. Hence, the large concentration of both cases and objects that we saw in the previous image of room 95, where all the objects from the collection are on display in what could be called a study gallery, with every object in the collection available to the public, which is a contrast to some other collections at the British Museum, where some objects will be in the public galleries and other objects from a collection will be in secure store, are accessible to the public, but through request via the departments, who can then bring objects from secure collections to study rooms attached to each of the departments in the museum. And we have to remember that the context for this is that within the British Museum, only about 10% of the objects in the collection are on public display at any one point. Hence, Percival David's provision that 100% of his collection had to always be on display as part of that 10%. The next collector we're going to meet is Anne Hull Grundy, and she was born in December 1926 in Nuremberg, Germany. Her family resettled in England when the National Socialist government took power in Germany in 1933, and her father re-established his metal business in Northampton. And this business, the Met Toy, became a household name as the producer of corgi cars. And it was the profit from these toys, together with income from the family banking firm, which enabled Anne to create one of the greatest post-war collections of jewellery. In 1949, she married John Hall Grundy, and shortly after this, she was diagnosed with a chronic respiratory illness. But her purchase of fine arts continued, with trusted dealers bringing works to her at home. Now, a 1976 catalogue of an exhibition of decorative arts at the British Museum made Anne realise that the existing British Museum collection ended in the 1700s. And she resolved to update the museum collection by specifically acquiring objects from the 1700s and 1800s. And the value of her donation stemmed from the detailed documentation of the artworks, which gave them a provenance in terms of where they were created and their date of manufacture, but also a provenance in terms of where she had brought them and how much she had paid to acquire them. Although the British Museum has received many important pieces by well-known makers, no less than 70 other collections also benefited from her knowledge and generosity, including items from her collection which are at Cambridge, Manchester and in Glasgow. And we're going to have a quick look at 3 items from the collection held at the British Museum. At the top on the left, we have a miniature bugle in gold with a little chain for suspension. And on the back, it is engraved Balaclava, October the 25th, 1854. And this piece was made to commemorate the charge of the Light Brigade at Balaclava during the Crimea War. Bugles said to have been used at the charge became cherished relics, and one is still preserved in the National Army Museum. So this particular piece is a small jewellery piece which is picking up on the public interest at the time, not only in the Crimean War, but more particularly in the charge of the Light Brigade, and also in the bugles that then returned from the Crimea with their regiments to Britain. And we know that this particular piece was bought in 1973 from a dealer in St Christopher's Place, London, and it was donated to the British Museum with its original invoice, which shows that it was purchased for £20 in 1973. Below it, we have a set of glass paste jewellery, probably made around 1750, and it's an ornamental pin in the form of a spray of flowers, and it's backed with silver and set with brilliantly coloured red, blue, green and yellow foil backed paste. Now, paste is handmade glass that has been polished with metal powder until it shimmers to the same intensity as a gemstone. And the popularity of paste jewellery quickly rocketed, the appeal being that it was almost impossible to tell the difference between paste and the real thing. And before 1940, most imitation jewels were made from glass with a high lead content. This glass was called paste, and the reason it was called paste is because the components of the mixture were mixed wet to ensure a thorough and even distribution of not only the chemicals but the pigments added before it dried as glass to then be cut and set into jewellery. Then the final piece we have on this slide dates from 1840, and it's a tortoiseshell comb with a 2-coloured gold mount, and it's set with rubies, and it also has a dove. Here we can see the gold dove, which is itself set on a trembler spring, which means that whoever was wearing it, as they moved their head, the dove would appear to float and fly above the gold leaves. And the reverse is inscribed with the name of the comb manufacturer, Pierce Dalton, whose workshop was in St Martin's Court. And it was also purchased and then donated to the museum in its original leather case with a labelled silk lining in the lid. And this is inscribed with the name of the jewellers who would have originally sold it, who at that time had a shop at 46 Conduit Street, where they actually remained in business until 1854. And we know that it was purchased by Anne in 1953, and it came with its original invoice showing that it was purchased for the sum of £60. So we have an example of 3 different items acquired by Anne Hall Grundy, which were then donated, and a large number of which are on display at the British Museum upstairs in Gallery 47 where objects from her collection dating mostly to the Georgian and the Victorian period pick up the story of jewellery and ornamentation going back in not only British but world history that you can see in other galleries at the museum. What we're going to do now is we're going to take a 10-minute break, after which we're going to come back and see a completely different side to Anne's collection that takes us to a completely different part of the world. And during that time, I'm going to leave these 3 pieces on screen. So do enjoy them, and I will see you again in 10 minutes after our coffee and comfort break. Hello, as I said before the break, we are now going to look at another aspect of the collection of Anne Hull-Grundy, and this is a set of objects from Japan. Now, Anne was also interested, alongside European jewellery, in the arts of Japan, particularly netsuke, which are carved ornaments worn on kimonos. She never went to Japan, and she made many of her purchases by post. Now, traditionally, Japanese clothing did not have pockets. And although the sleeves of a kimono could be used to store small items, if you needed somewhere larger or stronger to store personal belongings, then the development of small containers hung by cords from the robe sashes occurred. Now, these containers could be small pouches or small baskets. I suppose you could sort of say they're a bit like a hanging external pocket. But the most popular type were boxes, held shut by sliding beads on a cord, such as the example you see here. So the container, the fastener, the cord, and then at the top, the netsuke, which is the small ornamentation on the end of the cord, which allows it to be hooked and held over the sash. And we see here an example of one of the netsuke in the British Museum collection given to the museum by Anne. And it includes the container itself and also a small netsuke carved from ivory in the shape of an opera mask. Now, netsuke are mainly made from ivory, but they can also be made from horn and hardwoods such as boxwood wood. And there are different styles of netsuke. And we have here 3 examples of 3 different netsuke and 3 different styles of netsuke. So the one on the far left is what is called sculptured netsuke. And this is a hare with a loquat fruit, which because of its golden colour represented gold and wealth. And the hare or rabbit, one of the 12 animals of the zodiac cycle based on the Chinese system. And this might relate either to the current year, the year that the netsuke was made, or the birth year of the owner. It's made from ivory, and it's inlaid, such as the eyes, with dark horn. And it dates to the late 1700s. And all the netsuke in the collection are very small. One of the reasons why they were easy to acquire by post. This particular example is only 3.5 centimetres from bottom to top, 2 centimetres deep, and from side to side, 4 centimetres. Next to it, at the top on the right, we have what is called a hollowed netsuke. And here you can see inside Mount Fuji with a man leading an ox below clouds and a bird which are carved onto the outside of the netsuke. I'm sorry, I'm not sure why that's picked up that box there. There we go, that's better. So the piece of ivory has been hollowed out decorated on the outside with Mount Fuji, the bird, and then we've got another angle from the side which shows slightly more clearly the man and the ox carved out of the center of the piece of ivory. And this has a width from one side to the other of 4 centimeters. And below it, we have a flat round netsuke, and these are known as manju netsuke because they are shaped like a manju, a type of Japanese sweet. And this shows a tiger. We can see both sides of the netsuke, with the tiger on the top in a torrent of water. And we can see the waves of the river as they flow around the tiger. It's made from ivory, and then the tiger, to accentuate its body and the stripes, is gilded with copper. It is also carved with a continuation of the river waves underneath, and you can see the holes where the cord would run through the back so that it then could have the container, the box, fastened underneath it. And this particular one dates from 1900, and it's slightly larger because it's 5.5 centimeters from side to side. And a number of the netsuke from Anne Hull Grundy's collection are part of the collection of the current Asia department, are on display in the Japanese galleries at the British Museum. So in fact, her collection now sits across 2 different departments, the netsuke being part of the Department of Asia, and the jewellery, which we were looking at before the break, being part of the collection of Britain and Europe, on display in room 47. The next collector we are going to talk about is Henry Salt. Now, one of the questions that I picked up during the comfort break was about where did Sarah Banks store her collection if she lived with her brother? Well, her collection of coins and paper was stored in wooden cabinets with thin drawers in her bedroom, with paper items pasted into scrapbooks. But it does raise the point of, if you're going to start a collection, not only do you need money, but you also need space. And Henry Salt is a very interesting example of a collector, because he at no point could be said to have housed his collection himself personally. He collected directly on behalf of the British Museum. He was the son of Thomas Salt, a doctor, and Alice Salt, and was born in Lichfield in 1780, and he was the youngest of 8 children. And he actually began his career as an artist, studying under John Glover. He came to London, where he continued his art training, although after a while he gave up portrait painting, having failed to build up enough of a reputation to sustain himself. Instead, he found a position with Viscount Valentine, travelling as the Viscount's secretary and draftsman. And in 1802, they set off on a journey to India via Africa. During this tour, Henry made sketches of local sites and scenes, and these paintings were then used as part of the Viscount's publication in 1809, recording his voyages and travels to India. Salt was sent to Ethiopia in 1809 on a government mission to develop trade and diplomatic links with the Ethiopian emperor, who unfortunately he was unable to meet due to unrest in the country. But he returned home in 1811 with a collection of plants and animals. And then he himself published a book about his journeys with illustrations based on the drawings he had undertaken at the time. And it was through this book that he earned himself a name in the British government and was then offered the post of Consul General in Egypt in 1815. He arrived in Alexandria in 1816 and then travelled down to Cairo, where he was to be stationed. And he immediately began to collect ancient artifacts, which he planned to sell to the British Museum. And to facilitate this, he cultivated good relations with the ruler of Egypt, negotiating trade and territory deals on behalf of the British government. He was also involved in excavations at Thebes and Abu Simnel, and undertook research himself on the pyramids at Giza and the Sphinx. And it was while he was based in Cairo that he met Giovanni Belzoni, who was to become his main agent working in the field to collect objects on his behalf. And we see here on the screen to the left a portrait of Henry Salt himself, and then to the right a portrait of Giovanni Belzoni with a number of the objects which he collected on behalf of Henry Salt, and a number of which are now in the collections of the British Museum, and one of which in particular, this one to the far right, we will meet in a moment. Now, Salt acquired his first collection over the 2 years, 1816 to 1818, and he shipped it back to Britain, and it had an approximate value of £8,000, although it was eventually sold for much less in February 1823. The collection was not sold to one institution, and the sarcophagus of Seti I was bought by the architect Sir John Soane for £2,000 and is currently in his museum near the British Museum, while the rest of the collection was sold to the British Museum, again for £2,000. So in all, he got back 50% of the value of the collection. He then began acquiring his second collection between 1819 and 1824. And this time, his primary intention was to sell it to the British Museum for a yearly pension of £600. But the collection was rejected due to the price, and instead the second collection was bought by the French for the Louvre in 1826 for the price of £10,000, and that collection is currently on display in Paris in the Louvre. Salt then started a third collection, which began in 1825 and ran until his death in 1827, and this third collection was sold in its entirety to the British Museum after his death for over £7,000. One of the largest items which Salt collected in Egypt and had transported to Britain and sold to the British Museum was the head of Ramses II, the upper part of a huge granite statue which stood outside a temple to the cult of Ramses II. And the item is carved from a single piece of granite, which has two different seams of coloured granite running through it. The darker are below the lighter orangey red granite. It weighs in total 7.25 tonnes and is carved with the eyes looking slightly down. So not only would the statue have towered above the ancient Egyptians who viewed it due to its size, but the carving of the eyes would mean that it looked as if the statue was looking down upon the pharaoh's subjects standing beneath. Now, the statue had already been identified by Napoleon's men during the French expedition of 1798. And they attempted to dig it out and remove it. And it is during this attempt that the hole on the right-hand side of the torso is said to have been made. It was finally dug up and removed in 1815 by Belzoni, who used his hydraulic and engineering skills to pull the statue, as we can see here in this sketch held at the British Museum, on wooden rollers to the banks of the River Nile. And this took 17 days of work by 130 local workers to not only uncover, but move the upper half of the statue, which by this time had already broken in half. The lower half remains in situ in Egypt. It was then shipped along the Nile to Alexandria, where it travelled across the Mediterranean and through to Britain, arriving at Deptford in 1818. It was acquired by the British Museum in 1821 and displayed in the old Townley galleries, which have now been demolished for several years. And what we see below is a sketch of it being installed in 1834 in the new Egyptian sculpture galleries, room 4, where it stands to this day. And the size and the weight of the object meant that it had to be installed with the help of the Royal Engineers, who were used to moving large cannons using ropes and lifting equipment. And the soldiers themselves were under the command of this gentleman, who we see sitting down, a Waterloo veteran, Sir Charles Danzy, who is shown sitting down due to a wound he sustained during the Battle of Waterloo. Other objects from Henry Salt collection, which are at the British Museum, include a set of wall paintings from the tomb chapel of an ancient Egyptian government tax collector who collected taxes from the local farming estates on behalf of the pharaoh. And he is called Nevermoon. He lived around 1350 BC, and his tomb was cut into the hills around the ancient city of Thebes. The tomb itself was discovered around 1820 by an agent working in the field for Henry Salt, Giovanni de Anthony. Salt sold the paintings to the British Museum in 1821. But Anthony died in 1854 without ever revealing the tomb's exact location, which is still unknown today. So all we have from Nevermoon's tomb are the objects, the tomb paintings in the British Museum, and small fragments from the same tomb in other museums, such as the Berlin Museum. Now, what we see on screen are 3 of the fragments, which in essence is a decorative set of paintings running around the tomb chapels, which give us, the modern viewer, an insight into how Nevermoon hoped to live in the afterlife. So what the tomb paintings do is they capture Nevermoon's life in the real Egypt, and they aim to ensure that that is the life he enjoys after death in the Egyptian afterlife. So on this top hand left fragment, which is divided into 2 registers, we see in the upper register a herd of cattle being brought to Nevermoon. And at the front of the cattle, the herdsmen bow down, and they are next to a standing scribe who is recording the size of this herd. And this is a way for Nevermoon to demonstrate in the afterlife his wealth and his position and his ownership of a huge farming estate near ancient Thebes. And the hieroglyphs on the lower register record an imagined dialogue going on between 2 of the herdsmen. And it reads, "Come on, move off. Don't speak in front of this favoured one. People who talk are his horror. He does what is true. He does not pass any complaint. Pass on quietly. Truly, he will not just do the bidding of people, he knows everything. He is the scribe and controller of grain, Nevermoon. And this is being said by the cattle driver, who we can see waving his hand, not only to usher the cattle forward, but also to usher forward the other herdspeople presenting the herd to Nevermoon. And the tomb paintings strongly suggest that the tomb itself would have been accessible shortly after Nevermoon's death, so that people could come on not only to remember him, but also to place offerings in the tomb and wish him safe journey to the afterlife. The other tomb paintings also pick up this idea of the wealth and status and the luxury of Nevermoon's wished for life in the afterlife. So we see below an assessment of his crops on his estate, and we have a chariot being driven around the estate where the crops will be recorded, not only to demonstrate his wealth, but also to calculate taxes on the crop. And then next to it, we have the fragment of a tomb painting showing a pool in Nevermoon's estate garden, surrounded by date palms, sycamore, and also mandrake plants. And then in the pool itself, fish and waterfowl. And this again is an idea not only of the beautiful landscape which Nevermoon wishes to enjoy, but also the fact that he has a luxurious life in real life, which will therefore be transported into the afterlife. Now, one thing that we can notice about the later history of these objects, so between the time when they were painted in Nevermoon's tomb, before they were removed by the agent working for Henry Salt, is if you look at the cattle fragment, you'll see that part of the hieroglyphic inscription has been damaged. And this is where the name of the god Amun, which was part of Nevermoon's name, has been removed, has been scratched off, presumably as part of Akhenaten's reforms, when during his religious reforms, monuments had the divine names of the old regime gods erased. Akhenaten promoting the sun deity, the Akan, as the principal gods, and the name of gods such as Amun, another sun deity, being removed from publicly visible monuments and tombs. The ancient Egyptian idea being that if something is destroyed, if something is removed, it can no longer exist. To exist, it has to be seen. Hence, in fact, the tomb paintings themselves, because they exist, so Nevermoon will have this afterlife. We now come to our final collector of today, a gentleman called Brooke Sewell, and we see here a photograph of not Brooke Sewell himself, for whom I could find no photographic trace, but a gentleman called Basil Gray, who was the keeper of the Oriental Department at the British Museum and the chief correspondent with Brooke Sewell, who was said to have never visited the British Museum and indeed never visited London, but was a collector deeply interested in objects from India and the Far East. He was born Percy Thomas Brooke Sewell, and he worked for his family's merchant banking business, which specialised in Baltic business affairs. And he lived for the majority of his adult life in Switzerland. And on his death certificate, he was noted to be a gentleman of no occupation, indicating his personal wealth in later life. And what we have here is probably the first object that came into the British Museum collections as a gift from Brooke Sewell. It is a green jade plate with plant and flower design inlaid with gold and pearls. It was made in India in the 1700s and came into the British Museum collection as a direct donation in 1938. And the museum object tells us that it was accessioned into the museum collection as the first object to be registered on the 11th of October 1938 by the Oriental Department, nowadays known as the Department of Asia. Now, Brooke Sewell greatly admired the art of India and the Far East, and he thought they should be better represented in the British Museum collections. And to do this, he donated a number of objects that he himself had purchased, and also established 2 purchase funds, one by gift and one by will, which provided about £1 million for the sole use of the Department of Asia. And to help the direction of purchases, he corresponded regularly with the Keeper of Asia, Basil Gray, about the acquisition of objects from the late 1940s until his death in 1953. Now, the permanent fund was originally intended for the purchase of Indian jades. And then during the 1950s, it was agreed that it would be extended to include the whole of Asia, except the artwork of Japan, which Brooke Sewell disliked. Japanese objects were included in the early 1960s via a decision made by the British Museum trustees to purchase them from the Brooke Sewell bequest, a separate body of money from the permanent fund. And the British Museum can use the capital from the bequest to buy objects from anywhere in Asia, including Japan. Objects purchased from the permanent collection can only be purchased with funds raised from the income raised by investment of the capital. And here are 2 objects purchased from the permanent fund. They were purchased in 1958 from Christie's in London, and they are 2 objects that you see to the left. They are Indian Mongol dynasty bowls, which have been mounted at a later date on stands made from gold coloured copper, zinc and tin alloy on top of marble bases. So the bowls themselves are quite ancient, Indian Mughal dynasty, made around 1700. The stands are about 100 years later, date to 1798, and were made in France, transforming the objects from functional liquid containers, albeit of very high status and decorative order, into table or sideboard ornaments. And they were sold in Paris and had originally been part of an exhibition of domestic wares held in Paris in 1798. To the right, we see another object purchased from the Brooke Sewell Permanent Fund. This is Shiva, shown as the Lord of the Dance, with the Ganges, the holy Ganges River, flowing through his hair, and he is standing on the demon of ignorance, who he squashes beneath his right foot. And he is shown at the end of one of the dance cycles and the beginning of another, marking his role as both a destroyer and a creator god. It's cast in copper alloy, and it dates from around 11,000 AD, came from India and was purchased in 1987. Now, the last item we're going to see today is an item which draws us back to that comment that originally the funds provided by Brooke Seale could not be used for the purchase of Japanese objects. And it shows you what is probably one of the most famous Japanese objects at the British Museum, which was purchased from the bequest part of Brooke Seale's fund. And it is The Great Wave by Hokusai, probably originally printed in 1831 in Tokyo. There are about 113 identified copies of the Great Wave print, although scholars estimate that around 8,000 prints were originally in circulation. And these prints, which were part of a series known as the 36 Views of Mount Fuji, were made by Hokusai when he was in his late 60s, early 70s. And in this scene, he captures the moment just before a huge wave crashes down on a fishing skiff, which is transporting fish across the sea to the town of Edo. And the design would originally have been carved onto a set of cherry wood printing blocks based on the design created by Hokusai. And these blocks would then have been used in a specialist printing workshop to print onto paper the prints which were then sold by the publisher. And the popularity of prints by Hokusai means that when we look at the surviving wood print blocks, we can see the amount of wear that has taken place, indicating the many thousands of copies that were printed from each wood block. And the strong blue colour, which we see on this particular block, is a chemical pigment known as Berlin or Russian blue, which was only becoming available in Japan at the time from China. And unlike earlier blue pigments, such as indigo, it has a much greater intensity and does not fade. This particular print was displayed in an exhibition in Paris in 1988 and was then eventually purchased from Sotheby's in Paris in 2007, funded jointly by the Art Fund and the Brooke Seale bequest. And objects continue to come into the British Museum. This one, as we saw, was acquired in 2007, was on display in a recent Hokusai exhibition at the British Museum, and is an indication of what we said at the beginning of the talk, which is that the British Museum collection is a living and open collection which continues to collect objects and which continues to draw on donations of individual objects, archaeological excavations, and also draws in private collections made by collectors with an interest in particular parts of the world, particular elements of material culture, some of whom were collecting specifically with the British Museum in mind, some of whom probably never realised their objects would be on display at the British Museum today. So thank you very much for joining me today. And I am now happy to take any questions you might have. We've had one previously about Sarah Banks and her collection, which was housed in her bedroom. It must have been a big bedroom in Soho Square, but I'm also happy to take any further collection questions people may have. Thank you, Malcolm.
Thank you, Katharine. That is very, very good. The first question I have is, what motivated the collectors to take these items?
It's a very good question. And the answer to it, I think, changes over time. Because when we look at Hans Sloane's collection, what motivated him was the idea that was around in the Enlightenment, that was around at the time when he was alive, of all history being as one. So an interest in history as a single entity. Hence, his collection was a collection of what he saw as the world, which is why it includes, as well as objects, historical objects, natural history specimens. So you could say the paradigm, the context within which he is collecting, is an Enlightenment desire to understand the world as a whole and human history as part of that world. So that's why his collection, when it came to the British Museum, includes objects that you would not expect nowadays to see at the British Museum. You don't expect to see natural history at the British Museum, and most of his specimens are down at the Natural History Museum. A lot of his manuscripts in his books have now become part of the British Library collection. Now, later collectors start to work within the development of separate disciplines within history and within archaeology. So you see that post-Enlightenment, the development of particular subjects occurred. And some of these disciplines can be very carefully tracked, particularly through the development of university studies. So we know that Egyptology, which had been an interest going back to the Romans and the Greeks, became a university subject at UCL in the late 1800s. So Egyptology as a discipline actually develops quite late in a professional sense. So when we look at examples such as Henry Salt, he's starting to collect objects just before Egyptology becomes a professional subject. So his collections fall almost within the idea of the collections of ancient culture and ancient art and ancient wonders, the idea of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. So his collections are driven by not only his position in Egypt, but also in his case, the idea that by collecting objects which are becoming of greater interest to the public and which now have a potential home in a national museum, he can generate income. So he is motivated by his access to the source material, being stationed in Egypt as he is. Other collectors, such as Anne Hull Grundy, are motivated by her own personal interests. So she probably started collecting jewellery as a teenager, in the same way that you might know people who someone has a collection of china cats, or someone loves collecting this or loves collecting that and always gets given one of those for their Christmas present. When does it become a collection? When you've got more than three of the same thing. So her collection interest was driven by an initial personal interest, which then hooked into what she saw as a gap in the national collection at the British Museum, which she decided she was going to fill, having the funds to do so. Other people, such as Percival David, are purely driven by their own interest and their own ability to collect. And he has the financial ability to collect. If you're going to collect, you also need space. So he buys a huge country house, and he buys a suite at the Dorchester Hotel. So he has the time, the money and the space to build a collection. But then he realizes that that collection could be broken up, and he's motivated to make it a public collection. Other collectors are not motivated to ever make their collections a public collection, and a lot of collections are sold by their heirs after death. It's quite interesting how often someone who has collected, their objects then initially pass to their family, and then you sort of have a trickle of that collection being sold over time and passing through various hands before it arrives at the British Museum.
Thank you. I think the next question is kind of relates to that a little bit. It says, I was wondering if the sister-in-law donated it because she was kind or because she wanted it out of her house.
I think that is a really interesting question. And I think the fact it was donated quite so quickly, it was donated and accessioned a year after Sarah Banks' death, I think it might well be the latter. I think it might be that possibly the sister-in-law had expressed an interest in what Sarah was doing during her lifetime. Perhaps this was a polite interest. And then suddenly thought, but I don't want this in my house any longer. It also could be motivated by the fact that the sister-in-law knew that at that point, it became a closed collection. Because once someone no longer starts adding objects to a collection, it becomes what is known in museum terms as a closed collection. And there are several of those up at the British Library, where the items were collected by a single person across a number of years, and that collection is no longer added to. So Sarah Banks's collection is a closed collection. So I think if we want to be generous, we can say that her sister-in-law realised that the best home for this collection on a permanent basis was as part of the national collection at the British Museum, where it was guaranteed that it would stay in national ownership forever. If we're being a little bit more practical, it could just be that she thought, I just want this out the house. I'm never going to look at it. I don't want people coming round looking at it. I'm not going to be available to show people these different drawers. I don't want to answer their inquiries about my collection. So she sort of hands all of that curatorship of the collection over to the museum, as well as getting a spare bedroom back.
Thank you. If the British Museum is offered a collection today, what criteria do they say do they accept it or reject it on?
Oh, that is a really interesting question. And I would say it's a question that falls into two halves. If an object is being purchased, then sometimes the criteria for purchase will be linked to the fund with which the item is purchased. And we've just seen an example of that with Brooks Sewell collection, where it can only be used to buy items from a particular part of the world. So however much you might want an object from Africa, you cannot buy it with the Brooks Sewell fund. The other side of it is that where the museum has the opportunity to buy any object, it will usually be looking at two aspects of its collection. It will be looking at filling gaps in its collection. So if there is an area that we know we do not have a good representation, so perhaps a chronological or geographical gap in a collection. And also, we try very hard to continue to collect. So a lot of the British Museum collection now includes modern objects. So my reference to collecting objects from Africa, a lot of the collection from Africa now is collecting modern African art installation and works by African artists. An example being the Tree of Life, made by Kester, an artist in Mozambique, which speaks not only to Mozambique's history, because the objects that are used to make the Tree of Life are decommissioned arms that were collected under a project by Christian Aid for turning people to hand their weapons in and then be issued with agricultural tools to try and rebuild the economy in Mozambique after the Civil War, but also speaks to the work of contemporary African artists. So while we continue to look back at our existing collections and where there are gaps that we can fill to create a better resource base for research in the future, we're also looking forward and going, we don't ever want to be a closed collection that has stopped collecting, because it's that idea of, well, why would anyone be interested in what's happening now? They will be in 100 years' time. It's like in the 1960s when they knocked down a lot of Victorian building because they thought it was ugly. And now we go, look at that ugly 1960s building. So we're aware that you have to keep collecting, because we're not just collecting for us, we're collecting for generations and scholars in the future.
Thank you. I think that's all the questions today. So I think we'll stop there. We're back next week for a Christmas themed one with Katharine. So from me, hopefully I'll see you all next week. And Katharine?
Thank you very much. And if anyone was with me for gift giving last year, you will be excited to know they are all brand new objects picking up the themes of why gifts are exchanged between people, not only because we are in a gift-giving season across many world faiths at the moment, but also looking at political, diplomatic and life occasion gifts as well, from across Europe and across time, including, I'll give you a little sneak preview, including a pair of socks.
I can't wait. That sounds fantastic. I'll see you, hopefully see you next week. Thank you.
Have a lovely week, everyone. See you next week. Bye-bye.